Hi there, and welcome back to Clarkenomics. In this video, we're going to talk about government price controls in perfectly competitive markets. So we've been talking about market graphs for a while now. We've done a whole bunch of examples. We said pretty early on, back in the demand unit, that these are perfectly competitive markets. Many buyers, many sellers, standardized products, all that stuff. But one of the things we've also been assuming kind of quietly is that this is in a market economy where the government doesn't interfere at all with the goings-on of firms and households. But what we're going to look at in this video is what happens when the government is active, like in a mixed economy, if they get active in markets, specifically if they start setting prices for things. So, the first kind of government price control, price intervention that we're going to look at is called a price ceiling. A price ceiling is when the government sets a maximum legal price for a product. And remember, a product can be a good or a service. So what that means is sellers cannot legally sell for more than a certain price. It puts a cap on how much they can sell for. But don't forget, in a market, there's always a buyer and a seller, right? It's two parties. A price ceiling also makes it illegal for buyers to pay more than a certain price. So keep that in mind. Now, we're going to look at a real life example of a price ceiling that's fairly common when economists study price ceilings. We're going to look at something called rent control. So, imagine, if you will, a market for apartments in like a big city. And we've got the price of an apartment measured in monthly rent over here on the y-axis, right? This is how many dollars a person has to pay to stay in their apartment for one more month. So it's their rent, it's the price. And then we've got quantity of apartments down here on the x. And just like we've been doing for a very long time now, we have a supply curve that's upward sloping. We have a demand curve that's downward sloping. This is a perfectly competitive market. There's many renters, many landlords, and apartments are all standardized. They're all exactly the same, so they're only competing on price. Now, in our schedule, we've got our rents, and we've got our quantities supplied and our quantities demanded. And let's take a look. Imagine, if you will, that our market equilibrium price is $1,000 a month, right? So X marks the spot where supply and demand cross. That's where we derive our market equilibrium price, which in this case is a market equilibrium monthly rent. $1,000 a month, and at that price, 4,000 apartments will be supplied and 4,000 apartments will be demanded. There is neither a surplus of apartments nor is there a shortage of apartments. So the market is in a happy equilibrium here. But then, let's imagine that the government, for whatever reason, and I'm not saying that their motives are bad or anything like that, but let's say that the government says, we're going to set a price ceiling of $500 a month. Now, what does that mean again? It means that is the highest monthly rent a landlord is allowed to charge for an apartment, and it means that's the highest monthly rent that a renter is allowed to pay for an apartment. So an apartment cannot be rented out legally, and we'll get into black markets and stuff some other time, but an apartment cannot be legally rented out for more than $500 a month. Okay, so if that's the case, think about what the effects would be on this market, right? We've got our price ceiling line, and we've got our circle over here. At a price of $500, the quantity demanded of apartments would be 6,000 apartments, right? You just take the price ceiling line, find your demand curve, boom, there it is. Quantity demanded is 6,000 apartments, because that's a low rent. So a lot of people are going to want apartments now at that low rental rate. But the landlords, they're not so excited, right? Sellers, renters, whatever you want to say, people who rent things out or sell things, they want high prices. And $500 is not a high price for them. So at that price of $500, they're only going to want to supply 2,000 apartments. So what is the effect of this price ceiling? Well, quantity demanded is 6,000, quantity supplied is 2,000. That's going to leave us with a shortage of 4,000 apartments. So, you can ask yourself questions like, okay, so is a rent control good or bad? Well, that's a little simplistic. It depends on who you're talking about, right? If you're one of these 2,000 people who got an apartment for $500 a month, you are thrilled for the most part because you got an apartment that's much cheaper than it would have been without this rent control. Without this rent control, the apartment would have been $1,000 a month. And either you would have had to pay that $1,000 a month if that was your willingness to rent, but maybe you wouldn't have even been able to afford that apartment and you wouldn't be living there. So in this situation, if you're somebody who gets one of these 2,000 apartments, you're much better off. But if you're one of the other 4,000 people who now will not get an apartment, you're looking for a place to live. So we've created a shortage of apartments with this price ceiling. So there are going to be winners and losers as a result of any government decision like this. So that's how price ceilings work with a somewhat real life example of rent control. The other type of government price intervention is called a price floor. This should be pretty easy to understand. It just works the opposite way. So this is when the government sets a minimum, not a maximum, a minimum legal price for a product. Again, what that means is if you're a seller, you are not allowed to sell that product for less than that price. And if you're a buyer, you're not allowed to buy that product for less than that price. And a real world example is the minimum wage. So, one thing to note is, again, we're dealing with perfectly competitive markets here. And in the real world, labor markets especially are not perfectly competitive. So you can apply some lessons from what I'm about to teach you, but this is not exactly in real life how things always work. So let's now imagine that the price of labor is measured in an hourly wage, right? So this is how much people are paying for labor and how much people are buying labor for. And then down here we've got quantity. Quantity of what? Let's just say quantity of workers. How many people are willing to work for a certain wage? And we've got our wages listed down the left column. We've got our quantity supplied of workers and our quantity demanded of workers. Now, one thing to remember, and this is a little weird, we're not looking at a product market in this situation. We're looking at a factor market because labor is a factor of production, right? Land, labor, capital. So look at the demand curve real quick. This is the demand for labor. Who, households or firms, is demanding labor, right? Who's the buyer of labor, households or firms? Think about it for a second. It would be firms, right? Households sell their labor, firms buy their labor and use that labor to produce stuff. So this demand curve is firms' demand for workers. This supply curve is households' supply of labor, right? Households are the ones who sell their labor to the firms in the factor market. And so households are the suppliers of labor, firms are the buyers of labor. So let's look at our market equilibrium hourly wage. The market equilibrium hourly wage is $10 per hour, right there, right? X marks the spot. And at that hourly equilibrium wage, 4,000 workers want to work, and firms want to hire 4,000 workers. So there is an equilibrium here, right? There's no shortage, there's no surplus. But let's imagine, for whatever reason, and again, we're not getting into the government's motives here, we're just looking at an analysis of the effects on a perfectly competitive market, that the government decides to set an hourly wage of $15 per hour as the minimum wage. What that means is, again, no buyer of labor, like a firm, is allowed to buy anyone's labor for less than $15 an hour. Nor is any worker allowed to sell their labor for less than $15 an hour. That is the minimum wage, that is the floor, that's the lowest that labor can be bought and sold for. So, this is our line. What is our quantity supplied of labor at $15 an hour? Well, it's pretty high. A lot of people, in fact, 6,000 people want to work because they can earn $15 an hour. So you're going to see a ton of people want to supply their labor, but the firms, the buyers of labor, they're not too hyped about this $15 an hour minimum wage. They don't want to hire that many people because they have to pay those workers. And so at a price of $15 an hour for labor, firms only want to hire 2,000 people. So in this situation, we've now got disequilibrium because of the government's intervention. We've got a problem here. The quantity supplied of workers is 6,000. The quantity demanded of workers is only 2,000. That's going to lead us to a surplus of 4,000 workers, which we call unemployment, right? These people want to work, but not for, they want to work at that wage of $15 an hour, but firms are not willing to hire them. And so, does this create winners and losers? Absolutely it does. The winners are these first 2,000 workers, right? If not for this government price control, they would have been making $10 an hour. But with the price control, they're doing the same job as they would have been doing before, but they're making $15 an hour now. So that's much better for them. But these 4,000 people are not going to get jobs. Now, it's not to say that those people all would have gotten jobs originally, because again, at the market equilibrium wage of $10 an hour, only 4,000 total people would have been hired here. But the people who don't get these jobs, they're the losers from this government price control. So That's how those types of things work. Now, sometimes government price controls are what we call non-binding. And non-binding sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. Non-binding means it just doesn't matter. It doesn't have any effect. It doesn't alter the decision making in a market. So non-binding, just think doesn't matter. So for instance, if a price ceiling is set above the market equilibrium price, it's going to be non-binding. It's not going to have any impact on the market whatsoever. If a price floor is non-binding, that means it's set below the market equilibrium price. And we'll look at an example of this. But this is what non-binding means in the context of price ceilings and price floors. A ceiling to be effective must be set below the market equilibrium price. If a ceiling is set above the market equilibrium price, it's non-binding. A price floor to be binding, to be effective, must be set above the market equilibrium price. If it's set below the market equilibrium price, it's not going to matter. Let's take a look at an example. Let's look back at our minimum wage graph that we just went through a couple minutes ago here, and imagine that the government set a minimum wage of $5 per hour. This would be an example of a non-binding price control. This would be a non-binding price floor. The minimum wage is too low here. The government's saying you're not allowed to work for less than $5 an hour, but people wouldn't work for less than that anyway. Sorry about that. So essentially, remember from our video about shortages, anytime the price is less than the market equilibrium price, if it's less than $10, you're going to have a shortage of labor anyway. So in other words, this would not be a binding price floor because that's set too low. For a price floor to be effective, it has to be set somewhere above the market equilibrium price. So bear that in mind. But also remember that just because a price floor or ceiling is non-binding or binding originally doesn't mean that can't change, right? Because these supply and demand curves are not static in real life, they shift around all the time. So maybe you set a minimum wage that at one point was binding, but due to things like inflation, that minimum wage is no longer a binding minimum wage. So there are many issues to consider here when you're talking about government price controls. So that's a little overview of how these things work in a simplified model. Thank you for watching.